Hello, everybody. This is James Diboe, Discovered, dedicated to original peoples as always. And we've got a special guest in Atlantis, Browder. How are you doing, my sister?
I'm doing well. Thank you, James, for having me.
Great to have you on. Great, anyway. There's some great topics that we're going to be speaking on today. We're going to deal with your timeline as a researcher, also some of your earliest books that you wrote. You were 8 years of age writing your first book, which is absolutely amazing, and also your trips to Kemet. And I also seen you on the documentary Heavy as the Crown, and there's some amazing things anyway. So we could begin from the beginning of your timeline of how did you begin as a researcher, and also let's start with your first book.
Yeah, sure. So, my experience as a researcher, I would say began very early on, being the daughter of a researcher, a writer, lecturer, traveler, Anthony Browder. Um, I was exposed to a lot at a very early age. And so I can remember as early as 5 or 6, working with my dad, going to different conferences, meeting with some of our great scholars like Dr. John Henrik Clark, Asa Hilliard, Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Ben. So being in those spaces at a very early age helped to give me a really solid foundation in terms of understanding why history is so important, why we must read, why we must do the research for ourselves. And so when I was 7 years old, I made my first trip to Africa. I went specifically to Egypt. And one of the reasons why my father took me on that trip at 7 years old is because he didn't want me to have to wait until I was in college. Like he did. He went to Howard University. And it wasn't until after he graduated from Howard University that he began learning the truth about who he was, about a person of African ancestry, and just the truth in general about our history before slavery. And so going on that first trip laid, even a greater foundation for me to eventually write my first book at the age of 8. And since the age of 8, I've been traveling around the world speaking to children and even adults, teaching about my experiences traveling to Africa, but more importantly, sharing what I've learned about our history prior to slavery, and even more importantly, why I continue to travel to Egypt and Africa in general, just sharing my experiences and what I've learned over the years. So um, my experience as a researcher began very early on at the age of 8, and I could not have predicted even then. I'm 41 now, but I couldn't have predicted at 8 years old the path that I would be on today. Which is, I've written 3 children's books. I've been to Egypt over 19 times. My father and I are currently involved in excavation. We are excavating 25th dynasty tombs. So there's so much that we've been able to do over the past 3 decades plus. Um, and what I've enjoyed the most about my experiences is really being able to help people turn the light bulb on, help them to develop a love for their history. And in the process of learning more about the history and who they are, it's inevitable that they learn to love themselves and see themselves and even the world in a different light.
Very interesting. So you exposed to this knowledge very early. That's amazing. That is amazing. So it's so when you started writing your first book, what type of book was it? Was it what, a children's book? Was it?
So it's a children's book. It's called My First Trip to Africa, and it
Okay.
chronicles my first study tour. Um, we traveled with about 15 people. I was the youngest person at 8 years old, and Miss Gladys at the time was about 90 years old. So she was the oldest person on the trip. Um, but yeah, so yeah.
Interesting though. Yeah, well, that's great. And that you've been exposed to not just what we hear all the time, slave trade, that's all we hear, but prior to the slavery, going back to 5,000 to 4,000 years. And this is very important. I come back from Egypt last November. That was actually my first time in Egypt, and I couldn't believe it, how amazed it was. And then also going down into what they call Nubia as one, and there's
Mhm.
still people, black people still there, which I thought was amazing because it's a lot. I mean, it's funny how like all the artifacts, all the evidence is there. But like in Cairo, I'd say, well, majority of the people are like Arab European type looking people.
Mhm.
So it's still interesting. I mean, there's very few people. I don't know. I'm interested in yourself as well. When you speak, did you speak to many of the people in Cairo about the history of the ancient Egyptians? Like, I'm just seeing what type of knowledge they have. I mean, I spoke to some people.
Mhm.
Most people were just like in denial that these were black people that built these pyramids.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's a really good question. And when I've had conversations with Egyptians, whether in Cairo or in Luxor, I find that I get different responses. So
Hmm.
the majority of the Egyptians, particularly those in Cairo, and we have to keep in mind that they have been educated through their own, systems, and so the narrative is much different from the narrative that my dad and others like ourselves write about. But there are many Egyptians who do not recognize or give credit to the Egyptians or the Cometians as being people of African ancestry.
Yeah,
Um, and what you'll find, and I'm sure you probably noticed this as well when you've probably started off in Cairo, and as you traveled further south, the Egyptians, their skin complexion changed. So the
yeah,
further south you go, the darker they become. And so what I noticed is that in Luxor, which is a completely different vibe from Cairo, it's more chill, more laid back.
yeah,
Um, but particularly in Luxor, you'll find as a tourist and a person of color, the Egyptians will, when they see you, hey, my brother, identifying you as their brother or their sister, hey, my Nubian queen,
yeah.
it does seem in those types of exchanges that there are a handful of Egyptians who do recognize us as being the originators of this culture, of this civilization. Um, we are the true descendants. And something else that's interesting, of course, we see Egypt as a Arab or Muslim country, but there are a lot of Egyptians, particularly as you go further south, who are mixed with Nubian blood or Sudanese or Kushite blood, right?
Yeah.
And so you never know just by looking at them. But it's always a beautiful thing to have conversations with those Egyptians who acknowledge their Nubian or Kushite ancestry, and they're just so happy to be able to connect with another melanated person who also knows that same truth. And so, part of the process, and part of the work that we have to do is making sure that the most accurate narrative is put out there, because so many of our people, not just black folk, but white folk, people of all cultures and races, they've been miseducated, and unfortunately, they've been told um, uh, a partial, they've only learned part of our history, but they've also been provided a lot of misinformation in terms of how our history connects, um, you know, with world history.
Interesting, especially like the more south you go. Like, I mean, the first place I landed was Luxor,
Hmm.
and then then I went to Aswan, went into Aswan, and then we took the boat across to the Nubian village, and
Hmm.
then obviously Kala was actually the last stop actually. So what was interesting was Luxor. I find it was like kind of like you say, the more darker melanated they are, they become, the more south. So I found like Luxor, like it was a very relaxed place, like you said. It's that was actually my favorite place to just chill and relax. And I found that like a lot of them, a good few of them were saying Nubians, calling us Nubians, and you like the Egyptians, and so straight away I got on with people in Luxor. There's Cairo was totally different. It was just like, well, you know, it was just like, how can I put it? Not the most friendliest people. So detachment. There wasn't like a connection. I didn't feel a connection with the people in Cairo. But then
Hmm.
obviously going down to Aswan. that was just like right at home there, going down to there. So, and you must have obviously you've been through the museum, you've the tombs, and what's the most fascinating thing that you've seen in Egypt yourself? Some of the most fascinating things.
Um, so everything is fascinated. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, definitely.
most people when they think of Egypt, they think of the pyramids, and it's one thing to see um images in magazines or even watch movies, but when you go there and actually see it for yourself, it's a completely different experience. So,
Yeah,
I love the pyramids because of how grand they are and just trying to imagine how our ancestors created that structure. So I love the pyramids, but I would have to say that my favorite location is Luxor. Karnak Temple
yeah,
is one of my favorite temples. It's the largest temple complex in the world, and even just beyond that, Luxor, there's 70 to 80% of what there is to see in Egypt can be found in Luxor.
yeah,
So as far as the temples and tombs, but Karnak is my favorite. You can spend days there, and still have more time to see to explore more within that space. But one of the reasons why I love Karnak not only because of the size of it, but there is a significant event that takes place. And I had the opportunity to experience this a few years ago. But Karnak Temple is oriented to the sun um, during the winter solstice. And so during the winter solstice every year, and of course, the pandemic kind of slowed things down. But prior to the pandemic, thousands of people would come from all around the world to visit Luxor on the morning of the winter solstice to witness the sun rising through the center of Karnak Temple.
wow,
And the fact that even thousands of years later, we can still see this astronomical event, it just really reinforces the extent to which our ancestors had mastered science, had mastered um, mathematics and architecture to create this particular experience. And there are other temples, including the Temple of Hatshepsut, which is
yeah.
oriented to the sunset on the winter solstice. But that's Karnak Temple is one of my favorite temples, and I would have to say my second favorite temple um, is Abydos, which is one of
Wow.
the old temple complexes. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
I didn't
Um,
actually. That's Aswan, but past Aswan, it's further south.
yes,
That's the
yes.
only place. That was one of the places I didn't have enough time to go, but that would have been amazing. What tell me about that?
So Abydos is one of the oldest temples in Egypt. And I'm not sure if you've seen National Geographics or other documentaries, but the original temple that you see when you walk to that location, that's not the oldest temple. The oldest portion of that temple is actually behind. Um, and this, the two temples, it's night and day when you talk about the comparison. I mean, they're both immaculate structures. But the temple in the back, which just recently has had the water drained, and so now, you can pay an extra fee to go visit that site. But the stones that were used to build that particular temple, they're humongous. Um, I mean, and you've been to the pyramid, so when you see those blocks in the pyramid, those gigantic stones,
Mm,
um, Abydos has stones that are similar to that. And one of the most interesting features of that older temple is the flower of life, which is supposed to be one of the oldest symbols. But within the Temple of Abydos, my favorite symbol, and you'll typically see this, the tour guides will point this out to you when you first enter that that temple. But if you look up on the ceiling, you'll see images of what is it, a helicopter,
yeah.
uh, a submarine, and what looks like a jet or maybe an airplane. And so every time I go there, I'm always trying to get great pictures, but I'm wondering, you know, You mean to tell me that 2000 years ago our ancestors were familiar with this type of technology? To this day, nobody can explain what those glyphs mean, what they represent, and to confirm whether or not our ancestors had this type of knowledge. And it almost
Yeah,
suggests that they had to have had this knowledge of that type of technology. So, the,
interesting
the temples
because
in and of themselves are amazing, but when you see those types of glyphs,
yeah. Well, you know what? Funny enough, you just brought up that I was only having this conversation only yesterday with a friend of mine about speaking about helicopters, submarines, and
Mhm,
so now when I spoke to your average Egyptologist about it,
mhm,
they were in denial that was no way that this could have been a helicopter or a submarine. So, you just leave them to say what they say. If they believe it, they believe it, they don't. So I was only having this conversation with a friend of mine yesterday who's actually been there.
mhm,
And we started questioning, like, I mean, it must have been some like to be able to build these pyramids, so many tons, the pair stones, and makes you wonder, like, what type of advanced technology are we was we dealing with? I mean, because it people can't build it now, basically, with all the technology we've got now. So it makes you wonder, I know they're very spiritual people, and some people go a bit overboard, like Hollywood, like, change the images, or they'll say aliens built these
mhm.
things or something. But from a lot of your research going there several times, plus your father, who's great expert on it, does he question some of these things? And like, does he wonder, like, well, you know, what type of civilization was we dealing with back then? That's been hidden, basically.
Mhm. Um, well, I'll say this. When it comes to different television programs that typically will give credit to aliens as the
Yeah,
originators of this information, that's something that I don't subscribe to, and my father doesn't subscribe to it.
yeah,
But what is interesting though is that, and we can find this in Kemetic texts, but the people of ancient Kemet, they believed that their ancestors came from a place beyond Earth. Um, and we'll find in different cultures, references to quote unquote non-earthly beings.
yeah.
So sometimes I even think that the idea that we have of aliens is often so far-fetched. And I don't I'm not against the idea of aliens. I think this universe is too small for us to be the only living beings on within this space. So I'm not against the idea of aliens, but I often think that the way that we portray them
That's
is
it. Yeah, the way they portrayed totally ET type of, yeah,
right.
yeah. I'm
And
totally
so it
dismissed that.
it could possibly be accurate that these quote unquote aliens were African people, were
Thank
African
you. Yeah,
people and came and brought this knowledge.
yeah,
But I still think it's important to give credit where credit is due. You can see, I believe it's in Luxor Temple where they have carvings on the wall where they show you how they put certain parts of the temple in place. For example, the Tekken, or what we know as the obelisk. And so you can see some examples that they've left behind in terms of their architectural knowledge. And I just really think it's important to give credit where credit is due.
yeah,
And I think that by specifically giving credit um to aliens for, passing on this knowledge, it discredits our ancestors. So I
yeah,
think be a little bit more realistic. But we know that these were human beings. We know these were melanated people who built these structures. They,
yeah,
as you've seen when you've gone to the temples, they painted the images in their likeness. The statues are in their likeness. So we know that these were human
yeah,
beings. Now, might they have been tapped into divine knowledge or, some other, you know,
yeah, definitely.
some other plane where they can access this knowledge? Quite possibly. But I think we just have to give our credit, give our ancestors credit where credit is due.
Definitely. I mean, because they were very, very spiritual people as well, you know, it's not just like I mean, we have science, but at the same time, it seems like the ancients seen like science and spirituality goes hand to hand. You
Hmm.
know, there's a lot of separation in the times that we're in. So
Hmm.
because everything's separated, people can't really make connections. It's like, it'd be science versus spirituality, or it's religion or something. So it's very interesting, the knowledge. I mean, like you got the Dogon, for example, you
Hmm.
know, some of the things that they say, about the stars, and it makes you wonder. Like, it's not just only Egypt; it's other parts of Africa and the world. Different parts of the world say different things. I've came
Hmm.
across a lot of indigenous peoples in many different places. Being
Hmm.
around the black peoples of Asia, I had to go into rainforest and out in the Pacific, Australia. So going everywhere, really. I mean, creation stories, they're everywhere. And at the same time, I understand that some things are metaphors. We can't take every word literally, but at the same time, there's deeper meanings
Hmm.
behind these metaphors, these creation stories.
Hmm.
So for yourself, you must have come across a lot of these creation stories. And I was watching the documentary you were on, and it was basically dealing with creation stories, which is very interesting. The Heavy is the Crown, and I don't forget the other documentary. You might have to help me out. There was Heavy as the Crown, and then there's one
Well, there,
before.
well, so out of darkness. So there's a part one and a part two.
Right, it was the one. Because I've only seen one of them. You see, it was the one where you were on. Are you on both of them, or are you on one of them?
I'm on both of them.
Okay, when you're all speaking about creation stories, and
Um,
so I get mixed. I always get mixed up with them because the title, when I was reading it, said "Out of Darkness" and "Heavy is the Crown." I was having this discussion with Professor Carver last week, and I was
mhm.
confused of why the title said both. So I weren't sure that. And then he explained there's two different documentaries, isn't it?
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
But even when we think about the creation story and just religion in general, we have to understand the purpose of religion and what it was designed for.
yeah,
So, let's just say, 2000 years ago, the common person was not necessarily literate, right? Education was typically reserved for those who were royal or for those who had money. But when you think about a person who is in power. You have a nation that is, a person ruling this nation who's responsible for, taking care of their people. But if you're dealing with an uneducated group of people, what tends to happen, not just within African culture, but around the world, is that they will create stories, use allegories, and things of that nature to help take a very simple concepts, right? But just kind of almost romanticize it, but make it more palatable for the person who may not be able to understand, um, certain concepts dealing with science,
yeah.
dealing with physics, and astrology, astronomy, and things of that nature. So they, put them in the form of a story to make it easier for people to digest, but also, as we know, religion has been used to control. But just, you mentioned just a moment ago about science and spirituality, and just on a very fundamental level, the word science simply means to know. It comes from the Latin word "sere," which means to know. So there's a science behind everything, and when we think about how knowledge progressed and developed over thousands of years, we had people who were um, you know interacting with their environment, trying to figure out how to survive. And once they mastered the ways of survival, through farming, sedimentary living, they were now able to have this extra time to move beyond the survival mode and begin studying and connecting more with things in their in their surroundings within their environment. So, observing the stars, and noticing that during this period of the year, there's a group of stars that are here, or during this time of the year, we know that every time we see these group of stars, the Nile floods. Just being able to correlate what's
Mm.
happening in the heavens to things that are happening on earth and putting those things together, documenting that information over time. Um, and just, going just, we can look at things on a very surface level. But then once you start digging deeper, we can see how everything in life within our world is interconnected.
Yeah, powerful. Now, what's interesting as well is when you speak on the afterlife is now, do you look at the afterlife as a metaphor, or do you see it as this is they will be, what have you found with the afterlife when they speak about that? Like, because some things we look at as metaphor, some things we know this is actually what they truly believe.
Right. So what we do know about the people of ancient Kemet and their understanding of life and quote unquote death, or yeah, life or quote unquote death, I would I believe it's more accurate to say that there's life after life. We know that energy can't be created or destroyed, it just changes form. And so, there's spirit that's, animating this physical body, but once this fleshly body, dies, stops working, it deteriorates. But our spirit is eternal and goes on to another plane. There are different quote unquote psychics or spiritual people who, you know, are able to, communicate with spirit, and they, receive information about what happens, after we quote unquote die. But we do know that the people of ancient Kemet believe that the so-called afterlife was the place that spirits would go. Um, and specifically, there's a place in the heavens called Sahu, where the people of ancient Kemet believe that our spirit will go when we die. So of course, I haven't had a near death experience, so I can't necessarily say what actually happens.
Yeah.
Um, when we die, but just this concept of knowing that energy doesn't, cannot be destroyed, cannot be created or destroyed. So it just changes form. And so our spirit, I personally do believe in reincarnation, that each life that we live, the singular life, it's too short to learn all of the lessons that we would need to evolve spiritually. And so we come back in different bodies and have different experiences so that we can evolve spiritually. Um, and even within different cultures, they have quote unquote angels. They have these spiritual beings, um, spiritual guides, different entities that play their own role on the spiritual realm to you know, help us humans navigate things in the earthly realm. And I do feel that there are more than enough people who have had experiences, some that can't even be explained, but they are enough to let us know that everything exists in duality. We have the physical realm, we have the spiritual realm. Everything exists within duality. If there are things that we can see, that there also has to be things that we can't see. And I believe that once you begin to open yourself up to concepts like that, and embrace that possibility, then you begin to remove fear from your mind. And in the process of removing that fear, you open yourself to having these spiritual experiences where, nobody else may be able to confirm it like you do, but you've had that experience to let you know, whether it's connecting with an ancestor, whether it's receiving information and then following up to say, oh, wow, you know, I didn't have, background in X, Y, and Z, but I received this message, after doing a meditation and, maybe even asked to get confirmation. Who is providing this information to me? Is it my spirit guide? Is it an ancestor? Because we have so many people out there nowadays who say, I got this download or God spoke to me. For thousands of years, people have said that God has spoken to them. But I do believe that each person has their own, personal connection with the creator. Um, but even within all of that, each person has their own unique spiritual experience that confirms that there's more to life than what we can see. But as far as life after death or life after life, I stand firm on the concept of karma, that the things that we do in this lifetime will affect us in the next lifetime. And in fact, the lives that we're living now have been impacted by what we've done in a previous, or maybe what we didn't do in a previous lifetime. And the thing that helped me to come to this understanding and accept that as at least one reality is, thinking about babies who are born into this world blind, babies who are born with cancer, with, no limbs. How is it that a baby could be born into this world? What could they have done? Of course, we know that, the mothers, and there are certain things that they might experience that can impact the baby, but a woman who is healthy, who's been eating good, exercising, has the right mind, has a stress-free life, but that, and, maybe no genetically no history of certain illnesses, but we see this baby coming into the world the way that it is. And the only thing that makes sense for me and that can explain it is this idea of karma. That the spirit of that particular baby must have done something in a previous lifetime to be reborn in that way. And so it's just a matter of understanding that we all have a journey, different journeys, but we are all here to learn lessons. And the purpose of life is to create, beautiful memories, but to make good decisions so that when we come back, we can pick up where we left off. But more importantly, we are leaving the world in a better place for future generations.
Very interesting, pretty powerful, and I'm really happy how you put that. Because it's interesting to have these type of discussions. Like some people say, if they are religious, they'll deal with hell, heaven, and and then there's people who are completely what you call atheist. Now, when we say atheist, what I mean, like I'd say where I stand, myself, me personally,
Mhm.
I believe in a creator, some sort of. Now, when I say creator, I don't want to make it sound like the concept of God, how religion has put it. I mean, I personally believe that there's a creator. I don't make no likeness at all of what the creator is. Now, I'm
Mhm.
aware of a lot of our ancestors spoke on the divine feminism of the seeing the black woman as God, like the
Mhm.
goddess. Now,
Mhm.
don't get me wrong. I think sometimes people they take blow it out of proportion, where as if like we're dealing with energy. That's what it is. So sometimes like I try to be clear, but it just all depends on who you're talking to. And
Mhm.
some people don't have an open mind. So it's just a lot of hard work to even put it across to them. But I like how you broke all them different elements down, being reborn again and karma, because
Mhm.
karma definitely it has to exist some way. And also, even as we're alive and people are doing bad things, karma
Mhm.
can hit them. It's a matter of time whether it hits them in this life or the next life or whenever, or it was beforehand. So it's really these type of discussions they're not lightweight discussions. These are really serious topics. So I'm great I can have this dialogue with you, and I've had to open my mind, especially meeting a lot of indigenous peoples, and it wasn't even just about only that. It was the energy you carry yourself before you even gone there.
Mhm.
Then you start realizing that this was all meant to be. I was meant to meet this person. I was
Mhm.
meant to have this conversation.
Right.
And it's almost like stuff that we already really knew,
Mhm.
but we just got the extra confirmation by connecting to the people or connecting to the environment, connecting to that, our spiritual self.
Mhm.
And it's almost like Professor Carver was saying, I spoke to him last week. It's almost like you're switching your light on, is
Mhm.
how we put it. So I thought that was interesting how we put it because there's certain things that until you go and actually experience something, you can never really explain something. And even something that you go and experience, sometimes it can be difficult to explain it, the
Mhm.
unexplainable, So it's interesting that we're touching on these topics because I'm really deep on things like oral history, creation. I do love science, don't get me wrong, I like science, but I don't think science by itself can cover everything. Not the science that Western science, I call it, that's a lot more deeper than that. And have you got have you got much time to continue if we run out of time?
Yeah, no, we can definitely continue.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we'll keep it going anyway for now. So, what else? 'Cause this conversation's great. Definitely like speaking on the spiritual. So, what do you find with the word God or Creator in ancient Kemet? I know we have Amun Ra, the sun god, but at the same time, dealing with Amun.
Hmm. Hmm. So, um, I tend to look at things from, well, okay, well, let me put it this way. What we do know about the people of ancient Kemet and their understanding of a creative force is that they typically associated this concept of God with the sun, right? So Ra represents the sun. In fact, there were three names for the sun. So when the sun rose in the east, it was known as Kepra or Kepre, which means rebirth. When it reached its highest point, at noon in the sky, it was known as Ra or Re, or God on high. And even today, we still use the word Re to represent, or to describe a ray of light. But Ra represented God on high when the sun or the divine energy was at its highest point. And then when the sun set in the west, it was known as Amen. And the word Amen means hidden or concealed. And so these symbols. So Kepra is also a beetle, but these different symbols that represented the sun, which also in essence represented God. For me, I perceive God through the eyes of the ancient Egyptians as a force that reinforces life. But on this physical plane, it's inevitable that anything that is born is going to quote unquote die, right? That's just the cycle of life. And I think we as humans, we've kind of associated so many negative things with death. We taught to be afraid of death. We prepare for life, prepare to bring a baby into this world and do all the things that are necessary to help navigate, however many years that it would live. But we don't necessarily do much to prepare ourselves for quote unquote death or this transition. Um, but we do know that the sun was a symbol that represented the creator, because without the sun, we would freeze to death. Without the sun, we wouldn't be able to grow food in order to eat. Without the sun, there would be no life on earth. So that is, the primary reason and what makes sense as to why the sun will be the symbol associated with the creator. But I do believe, as you said, and I know time might be running out, so just let me know if you just want to.
Yeah, very interesting what you're saying. If you could continue, I mean, after when I met the Maasai tribes in Kenya, he would tell me about their god called Engai, and they call him sometimes Enkai, and he said he's duality, and it was like almost like connecting it to like the forces of nature.
Mhm.
So back to the forces, what you were saying before. You can continue, please.
Yes, absolutely. So, in essence, the things that were associated with the creator or something divine, they were typically things that we can find in nature. So, for example, I mentioned that um, one of the names for God or the sun was Kepra, which is a beetle. Ra or Re, the sun on high, represents the sun. And so we find that they use things within their environment to associate with divinity or things beyond, or things associated with creation. So, and one thing I wanted to say about the sun, and we talk about this when we do our Egypt on the Potomac field trips of Washington, D.C., where we take people around the city to show you how the founding fathers incorporated ancient Egyptian history, culture, architecture, and symbolism into the design and layout of Washington, D.C. But in Washington, D.C., there's a street called 16th Street. DC is designed in the shape of a square, and 16th Street divides DC in half. And 16th Street is the meridian line of Washington, D.C. And what that means is that on specific times during the year, the sun rises above 16th Street. And so the idea behind this meridian line is that whenever the sun is above a meridian line, anything that is on that pathway is infused with spiritual energy. And so it becomes very clear that um, not only do we know that our ancestors were in tune with their environment, but they were also in tune with the energies that emanate from different things within our environment, whether it's the sun or whether it's the moon. But going back to your question in terms of a creator or a God force, when we look at ancient Kemetic culture and spirituality, we see that they recognize something called Neter or Neteru. Neteru or nature are aspects of the creator. So, for example, you have a nature known as Heru, which the Greeks called Horus, but Heru would be represented with a falcon head and with a human body. And in fact, all of the nature or their quote unquote deities are associated with some type of animal or with some type of insect or something associated with nature. And so it becomes very clear that as human beings, having this quote unquote animal head that's associated with a specific spiritual energy, it's almost as if by calling on, we know that words are power, we manifest things through our words. And so when we embrace a particular nature, let's say, um, Het Heru, which is the symbol of a cow. She's associated with the love and divine feminine energy. So, for example, if you are going to engage in an activity where you want to tap into love, tap into divine feminine energy, you will call forth the name of Het Heru, or possibly imagine yourself surrounded by symbols that are associated with Het Heru. But just this idea of having an animal head on a human body represents the divine forces of that particular entity coming into our body and animating it for and allowing us to use that energy for a specific purpose. So I do feel that throughout history, different cultures have always tried to separate quote unquote God and human beings. But it is my understanding that not only is God around us and is in every living thing, but God is also within us. You mentioned something earlier that I think was really important, which is this idea that God is energy. And what is or spirit, what is spirit? Spirit is energy, right? And so a long time ago, as I matured and became more knowledgeable, I stopped accepting the idea, as many people still do today, that God is this person, sitting in a chair, waving a wand, you're gonna get cancer today, you're gonna get into an
Yeah.
accident. It's not like that. Um, we can assign quote unquote human characteristics with a force that is, non-human. So, instead of, saying that God is a he, or even God is a woman. It is a force that carries masculine energy. There are certain characteristics that are associated with the masculine, logic, math. There are also things that are associated with the feminine, intuition, and things of that nature. And so we can see and it is my understanding and belief that the union of masculine and feminine energy is the representation, and specifically on earth is a manifestation of divine energy or quote unquote God.
Interesting. Now, there's one time I was watching your father on, I'm not sure, it was Rock Newman show,
Mm-hmm.
and he was speaking about the book The Secret. I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
you've heard of that book called The Secret.
Yes.
And these concepts seem to be all taken from places like Kemet or other places. And I think he called it The Secret before the Secret. He was speaking on it. I'd have to go back to it. But books like The Secret or like manifestations, people, like I think the concept is a bit different, maybe in this day and age, where you just want this, and it comes to you. It's a bit more to it than that. But do you find like when we say manifest things, so in a point where like is it the fact that you've got to feel the energy to manifest something, the energy's got to be there, or is it the fact of like it's an idea first?
Hmm. Um, well, I'll say this. One of the first, actually, the first two books that my father gave to me, that helped me to understand this topic that we're talking about. The first one was As a Man Thinketh by James Allen. It's a really good book. It's an easy read that I would recommend to anyone who, wants to gain a better understanding of, the relationship between the mind and body and the spirit, this idea of manifesting things. But another book is called The Power of Your Subconscious Mind by Joseph Murphy. But both of these books help me to gain a better understanding of what we refer to as manifesting. Um, and now, even though I don't necessarily subscribe to the Bible, but one of the things that they do reference is that in the beginning was the Word, right? And so the Word was used to speak things into existence, to literally speak everything into existence. Um, and part of my understanding is that before we speak anything, what do? We think it, right? So thought is sub vocal speech. And so before we speak anything, we think it. And so what determines the types of thoughts that we have? Well, typically it's our attitude, the way that we perceive things is going to, determine how we think and how we perceive people and other things in our environment. And so it is my understanding that our thoughts will then influence our words, our speech, and then our speech is ultimately, it's almost like what kind of, because I want to say that thoughts and words go hand in hand. Um, but thoughts are the seeds, right? And when you water those thoughts, the words and the actions are the flowers and the trees that grow from it. Um, so I do believe that it first starts as a thought because you can give your attention to literally anything that you want. And I believe that it is what you give your attention to that will ultimately determine how you think, that will ultimately determine how you speak, and will ultimately determine how you interact with others. So they're all interconnected, but I do believe that manifestation first begins with a thought. And you put something out there into the universe and the universe will respond to it. But just, and I'm sure with your own personal experiences, we see the different ways that we can tap into spirit, whether it's, you're thinking about somebody and literally a minute later they call you. Well, how is that possible? Did I send them their energy and they picked up on it, or were they thinking about me and I picked up, how is that possible? But I think it just goes back to this idea that everything is energy, and it's almost like a radio channel. Like if you turn to 95.5, if you're looking for something specific on that frequency, you got to tune into that dial to pick it up. And so let's just say on that channel is intuition. So you can't go to 88.9 looking for intuition when you know that you have to be on a certain frequency. And so the frequency that we're on is, connected to our thoughts. And like I said, connected to what comes forth through our words and our actions.
Sort of like there's so many dimensions out there, higher dimensions, and there's so many things out there, whether or not we can see it, but it's there, you know. So there's a time as well about 2013. I was taking my first trip to the Fiji Islands, and before I got there, about a couple of weeks before, I kept on having this type of energy, this type of feeling that I'm going to meet someone out there of some sort of importance. And it was like, it's where it's your who or what, Then when I got there, I ended up connecting with the high chief out there, and it was quite deep the way it happened, and it was just from speaking to some of the local people in the hotel. Normally, your average tourist, what they would do if they want to go on, they wouldn't get to meet the chief, but what they'd do is just go to the village The others get shown around, and they can see the chief's house, and that was it. So it was interesting. I met like an older person there who said that through connecting with them, because these are very in tune spiritual people, So he ended up saying to me, "No, we don't want you to do it that way. We think we want to take you directly to meet the chief." So they took me to the village. There was first of all, I had to go and present him a carver plant. This is part of the ceremony. So I had one of the local people take me into the town, got him a carver plant. I also had to buy one of them wraparounds, what you wear. And first of all, we had to go to the spokesman's house, which is over the road. You must go to the spokesman's house before you go to the chief's house. So now we go to the chief's house, make sure you take your shoes off. You walk in, and then when the chief comes in, he'll do things like free claps, and then he gives a speech. And then when it's time for me to speak, you have to give free claps. And we were having a good discussion. Now they have like a lot of oral history where they speak on. They came from Lake Tanganyika in East Africa, Tanzania. So this was very interesting. Now I learned this off Dr. Renaud Rashidi. He was my grandmaster teacher, who I was great to meet him, interview him, and also he came to Liverpool. I put on an event for him. Now, first time I actually seen Renaud Rashidi, he was speaking about going into Fiji, and they said they came from Africa. So when I was and this was actually when I was just like on the internet, just looking at Fiji, and then when we actually got there, and nearly every single person said that they came from Africa, but it wasn't like where like this everyone came from Africa, as we know, but how they talk more about recent ancestry. So they say they reached Fiji 1500 BC, and they came from Lake Tanganyika in East Africa. They were led by the chief, and they have like a book called The Legend, which is an old book, and they speak on the chief led them to the Fiji Islands. The hotel I stayed in was called the First Landing Hotel. It's called that because that's the first place the Fijians landed. And they have something in the shape of like it looked like I thought it was like a golf course, but it's like an actual left foot because the chief stepped out with his left foot when they first entered that island. So there was a lot of very interesting things, and like Renaud Rashidi said, everyone is aware of it there. It wasn't like where some people were miseducated, but I was quite surprised, like some of the oral history that they were telling me and how they treated us as, like, my roots on my father's side, we go back to Nigeria. So when I was speaking about Nigeria, they were more than welcoming, to like listen to our history. So that was one place that really stood out, Fiji. Now, being to other Pacific islands like Hawaii and Micronesia and Tonga Islands, but Fiji's the one that stood out with the African connection. Now, I'm aware of like Africans in ancient times anyway. They were navigating all over this world. Just like we're looking at ancient Kemet, where you can see pyramids, seeing the pyramids in Mexico, they obviously people. I don't just think that people just guess too much of a coincidence. There's a lot of coincidence where looking at Mexico, the pyramids there, looking at it, they've even got like a three-step pyramid in Tonga. Like it's not big enough like that, but the burial for the royalty, and they've got them all over the world, really. So, what do you think of some of these connections? And like we got Sudan, which is older than Egypt, their pyramids. So you must see a connection. Have you came across anything in your research where you've done comparative studies of maybe looking at other places in the world that are connected to Africa in particular?
Um, so not so much specifically. Um, the same thing that you've said about the people who live in Fiji and they acknowledge their connection to the continent. We know the same thing about the Dogon people,
Yeah.
who acknowledge their ancestors came from ancient Kemet. Even in Ghana, the name of the village is escaping me at the moment. Um, but in Cape Coast, there's a village of people who acknowledge that their ancestors also came from Kemet. Um, so I don't think it's a coincidence. But one of the things that I really love about our dear brother and scholar Runoko Rashidi is his documentation of where he traveled in the world to show that melanated people are everywhere. And the question we should ask is, why can melanated people be found on almost everywhere in this world? One of the reasons that is the case is because we know that the first human beings on this planet Earth were African people. Um, we know that particularly through science. So if if you or anybody in your audience ever has an opportunity to come to Washington, D.C., I would encourage them to visit the Museum of Natural History. They have an exhibit that's about a little over $20 million that was spent to do this research and put this exhibit in this museum. But there were over 150 researchers, educators, and scientists who, worked to put this exhibit together. And what they found over decades of doing this research is that at least 200,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens lived in East Africa, and they were the first beings on this planet. We know Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop talks about at least three different migrations out of Africa. But we know at least 200,000 years ago, African people were the only human beings on this, or only quote unquote race of people. Of course, I'm sure as you
Yeah.
know, the race is another construct that was used to divide us. Um, but human beings were Africans were the first human beings on this planet 200,000 years ago. And what we do know now is that at least 60,000 years ago, those Africans migrated out of that continent and began to populate different areas in Asia. And then at least 40,000 years ago, another group of Africans traveled out of the continent and into what we now refer to as Europe. And scientists have actually identified the um, I'm sorry, the word is escaping me at the moment, but they found basically the genetic mutation that would have caused African people to, become quote unquote European as a
Yeah.
result of adapting to that environment for tens of thousands of years, lack of exposure to the sun, um, and all of those environmental factors. So, for example, even just looking at our physical essence, what makes melanated people different from Caucasian people? So, our hair, why do we have kinky hair? Why do they have straight hair? Well, people of European ancestry usually have straight hair because it helped to insulate their body, keep them warm, in those cold environments.
Mm.
We know that their noses were a lot thinner to prevent the cold air from coming in. So these physical changes occurred over tens of thousands of years, so that these group of people could survive in that environment. And so, when you really think about it, the first Asian people were African people. The first Europeans were African people. So it makes sense that Africans would be found in, on almost every portion of the world. So science has now begun to finally uncover and admit what we've always known, that Africans were the first human beings on Earth, and every culture, every race of people originated from us. And so, there's a lot more research that's being done to prove without a shadow of a doubt that what I'm saying is now our new reality.
Definitely. Yeah. And also, the Sahara Desert wasn't always there. So
Mhm.
that seems like it created a division in itself,
Mhm.
nature, just the environmental change.
Yeah.
So when
Actually,
we,
I
sorry,
want to. I want to share this real quick since you mentioned the Sahara. My father went to he did I think it was in 2007. I think it was 2007 to 2008. My father went to Egypt, and this particular trip, he went with his tour guide of 20 plus years, but his tour guide had wanted to take him into the desert, to to do some camping, like literally out in the middle of nowhere where there's no, cell phone communication, nothing like that. But in the white, and I don't want to give any misinformation, but I think it was the white desert. But nevertheless, when my father went to camp out in the desert, in the Sahara Desert, he found and even took pictures of of fossilized whale bones. So, he also found shark teeth, and other things that would have indicated that this sandy area was once covered by water. And like I said, with technology and with a lot more research being done, we're able to see that yes, the Sahara Desert was once covered with water, and other things related to the original people of this earth.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. Another thing as well, you see different researchers like, have you heard of Robert Bauval?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now he talks about the Great Sphinx being older than what we're told. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you get the date of like just a little over 4,500 years ago or something. So he pushes it back to like 12,500 years ago due to the water erosions which were ignored. Now, as your father came across or yourself anything like this, what dates do you use? Because you've done the excavations yourselves and that, and what dates do you come up with the Sphinx or even the pyramids? You find them older than what they say?
So as far as the Sphinx, I think a number of people have done the research to show, the difference between water erosion versus wind erosion. And so that evidence is very clear, to indicate that that particular space or area where the Sphinx or hair market is located was once covered in water. But as far as the pyramids and other structures, we are typically told that the step pyramid is the oldest structure designed by Imhotep. But one of the things that we noticed is that in most civilizations, um, they will, start off with nothing, right? They don't have any knowledge over thousands of years. They acquire knowledge through, observing their environment around them, and they reach this climax. In which they've almost, mastered certain aspects of information, whether it's math, science, astrology, architecture, um, and then it's almost inevitable that we begin to see a decline. And so there are some scholars who suggest that not only are the pyramids much older than we think that they are, but also that we have things in reverse. And so what we saw was the ancient Egyptians like mastering architecture, but then they're never able to recreate it, at any point in time in Kemetic history and culture. So it's this rise and fall of not only civilization, but inevitably knowledge, especially as you have conquerors who are coming in, trying to gatekeep, but stealing information and ensuring that the people whom they've conquered are not able to, continue to do the things that they once had thousands of years ago.
And I'm dealing with the first dynasty. They speak on 3,100 BC. You know, King Nana
Hmm.
coming from Nubia and
Hmm.
conquering and making it, unifying the land. So some scholars they see, well, there's pre-dynastic Egypt as well. So you got the pre-dynastic dynasties now. Some even think that Nana was actually, they take it back even a lot further than that. You
Hmm.
know, if you come across anything like this, of is it challenge that, or are you in agreement with 3,100 BC would be the first dynasty, or do you take it back even further over?
So I would definitely say that it goes back further than 3100 BC. What that exact date is, I cannot say.
Yeah,
As I'm sure you're familiar with the Coastal incense burner, but with these so-called well, not so-called, but they're pre-dynastic um um artifacts that have been discovered. And so, for example, on that incense burner showing um, a king who's wearing the Assyrian crown, showing um, uh, images of Heru, showing all the things that are associated with royalty in ancient Kemet. So if that was pre-dynastic, we know that no civilization is created overnight. An alphabet is not created overnight. Culture is not created overnight. And so the fact that they were able to identify this pre-dynastic artifact with all of these, encapsulating all of these things, it has to it only makes sense that history and culture did not start in 3100 BC. It had to have begun much earlier than that. Um, and what that date is, I can't say for sure, but
yeah,
I do know what we will find is that over time, as we continue to research, the dates will continue to change. But I also know that we're dealing with um, not necessarily competing with religion, but we do know that when we begin to acknowledge certain things about historical dates, certain civilizations, we know that it's going to create some type of conflict with the Bible, which is supposed to be, stand truth in terms of creation and when certain
yeah.
things come into place. But I do feel that society is beginning to shed their skin, shed that level of sensitivity when it comes to religion and understanding that all religion is man-made. Man is
Yeah,
not perfect. But
definitely
man
agree with
also,
that.
man also has an agenda, right? And
Yeah.
so you just have to be open-minded. And like I said, over time, more information is going to come out. So we might, take it back to 5,000 BC. We might take it back to 10,000 BC, but 50 years from now, we might find that it goes back to 20,000 BC. So that's why it's important that we continue to do research to unveil these things.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that about with Christianity or any religion. Yeah, the Hyksos invasion into Egypt, and it's almost like that when they speak on the Exodus, when the Hyksos were driven out, whether it was 150 years later or 200 years later, it's kind of like they match it with like the scriptures, if you know what I mean, like the Exodus. When you speak on the Exodus
Hmm.
and the time, but then unfortunately there's a bit of a gap. Maybe if it's like 200 years, because they give a date, don't they, like about the time of Moses. But then the Hyksos, which was obviously several hundred years before that. So I was wondering, like, with when we try and make the comparisons, so where do you think that is like where would you say the error comes in where religion is able to take off? Abrahamic religions in particular.
Well, I think we have to put things into perspective. So, for example, like you mentioned the Hyksos invasion and how they were eventually driven out. Well, we have at least four golden ages. Dr. Asa G. Hilliard chronicled ancient Kemetic history into four golden ages. And so we know that the Hyksos weren't the first and weren't the last people to be driven out of Egypt. Every time there was a new golden age, there was a family that came to power and were able to drive out these invaders and reunite Upper and Lower Kemet. And so, I think we have to put things into perspective. There wasn't just one Exodus. In the same way, when we talk about Jesus, the life of Jesus and how he was crucified on the cross. Well, most people don't realize, but during that time, crucifixion was the way in which people had to carry out their punishment. Jesus was not the only person who was crucified on the cross. Many criminals, hundreds of criminals were crucified on the cross. So we have to put things into context. But when it comes to religion or Abrahamic religions as it relates to Kemet, Again, we have to go back to the history. So whether you look at Constantine, whether we look at the gosh,
Conference in Nicaea.
of Nicaea, right? And there were many
Yeah,
councils of Nicaea, right? But what we know is that these Europeans came together specifically to determine what this quote unquote religion was going to look like, how they were going to spread that message. So there's so many different areas that you can pull together to make it very clear that um, the main religions that we accept today, we can trace them back to ancient Kemet. And I think the most obvious example of that is the story of Asar, Aset, and Heru. Um, we know that Heru was born of a virgin. We know that Heru was quote unquote born on December the 25th.
yeah,
But even with these stories, we all know that they are interpretations of what's going on in the heavens. So, like the
yeah.
birth of Heru is clearly associated with the winter solstice. And so there's a lot of different parts that when you begin to do the research and put the pieces of the puzzle together, it becomes very clear on how ancient African religions and spirituality, and more specifically Kemetic spirituality, has influenced almost all of the major world religions.
Totally predates them. And I know a lot of some people, religions, I get into these discussions with them all the time. And, I mentioned about the virgin birth, and what they try and say sometimes is the immaculate conception is not the same as the virgin birth. So, but at the end of the day, it predates them by several thousand years.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't even know how far further back we go with pre-dynastic Egypt or
Mm-hmm.
even other parts of Africa, because Dr. Ben Yoshi Ben Yakinen, he says that starts down in Uganda, the foothills of the Mountains of the Moon, where God happy dwells. So at the end of the day, I mean, it's got all the documentation there, but Africa as a whole, I mean, we couldn't even just like, I couldn't even just say which part of Africa had civilization in the beginning. We know that Egypt was the peak, the pinnacle, but at the same time, there's other parts of Africa, the findings of the Ashango bone in Congo,
Mm-hmm.
oldest mathematical tool. There's mining 40,000 years ago. There's so much, like you said before, about science. As we go into the future, it's getting better, the science, and it's unveiling so much. And who knows what they're going to reveal in the future.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
But I really appreciate this discussion. Sorry, were you going to say?
Oh no, I was just affirming what you were saying, and just again just wanted to reiterate how important it is for us to do the research so that we can tell the story from our perspective. We can't expect our oppressors or people who don't look like us to tell our story. So we just have to ensure that not only are we taking on that task, but we're also preparing the next generation of young people to be readers, critical thinkers, to be researchers and writers, so that they can, pick up the baton and continue this work. Because there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and so much information and knowledge that's waiting to be discovered. So,
Well, this has been a very powerful discussion, and I appreciate your knowledge, appreciate your time, and this is definitely worth a great discussion. And you've opened my mind on a lot of things as well. So I love these type of discussions. But I want to thank you very much. Atlantis Browder. This is James the Bone Discovery, dedicated to original peoples as always, and give thanks anyway. And maybe in the future we could do a part two when you have some time. But this has been an amazing discussion. So I really appreciate you. Thank you.
all right. Thank you, James. I appreciate you as well. I've enjoyed the discussion. Hope to see you next time.
Bless anyway. Peace.
All right.